what is the role of the finance sector? What is the role of the public sector? What is the role of the consumer? What should we be asking of the finance sector? Because it can't do everything on its own. But at the same time, we can't get there unless we've got the finance industry harnessed. So which particular bits would you say we need to be looking at it, focusing on?
Say anything, because I'm on mute now, I will say something, which is that, I mean, all of those that you identified are important. And look, it ultimately starts with, if I say the consumer, but really people. People set the objectives, and they've made clear that they want sustainability, and none more so than the people of Scotland. And, you know, it's the responsibility of the financial sector to enable the types of investments that are needed to get us from where we are to where people want us to be. And, you know, there's lots of lessons from the pandemic, but one of them is we can't shrink our way to net zero. You know, we shut down a quarter of our economy for good reason, for health reasons, and emissions only fell by 7%, not enough. And we have to do that year in, year out to be on a track for net zero. So we need large scale investment, and we need the financial sector oriented and looking forward to the pathways that are necessary. And that's why all those seemingly arcane, you and I love them, David, but I think Susan's quite fond of them as well, actually. But these arcane things like accounting rules and plumbing and indices and other aspects, we need all of that so that the financial sector has the information and the tools in some of these new markets to have that forward look to the pathway to net zero. But then what we need from governments is we need two things. We need some of the things that John Glen just talked about, which is to take those initiatives of the financial sector, private sector, and make them into rules and regulation, formal rules and regulations on accounting as example, disclosure, as he said. But then we need, you know, the broader policy suite that Kate was talking about and governments bring. And I'll give an example, and I'll stop on this one, which is it is very useful for consumers and financiers and ultimately business to know that you can't sell a new internal combustion vehicle in Scotland and the UK after 2030. That's far enough in the future that you can do something about it, but near enough that you have to. And that's what drives the investment in reworking and will get us to a position we have low emission vehicles increasingly on the streets of Glasgow, Edinburgh, and up and down the country. So it's all interlinked. Finance can do a lot. It can't do it all, but it should be out in front. And that's, I think, what we have coming out of COP26 in Glasgow.
Yeah, it's interesting, Mark. And this, you know, frequently I would be one of the people in the finance system complain about sort of excessive regulation, because often there is a huge amount of regulation, but actually without a clarity of what the rules are and where it is that we're headed, the world becomes very, very different difficult for finance. And the tragedy of the horizon is sort of doubled, isn't it? Because you don't really know where the world's going to be in 10 years. And then, Kate, it seems to me that, you know, this whole thing therefore becomes a big ecosystem of industry, government, finance, but it's also politically quite tricky because, for example, it's all very well to say, well, we want a transition, but we need a fair transition, a just transition. And therefore, there's a huge amount of sort of political judgment on how it is that we move all this forward in the right direction. It's not easy.
It's far from easy, and for those of us who have to face down our constituents every 5 years at an election, we know just how difficult it is. I mean, Mark sets out such a compelling vision, though, not just of the commercial opportunity, but how we do it. So this notion of not being able to just shut down or shrink parts of the economy, it's about growth and development in the right areas. And I think that's where we see the opportunities for Scotland. So we know already that it's in, say, Scotland-based investment funds are managing significantly higher percentages of the UK's responsible investing market compared with the share of the conventional market, and that has formed a significant part of the sector's strong growth in recent decades. So there's an example of precisely what Mark's talking about. Here's an opportunity for growth. And, you know, from a Scottish perspective, our financial services is a bedrock. So if financial services is doing well, then the Scottish economy is doing well, and we are well placed. The next thing I would just identify is that we are making great strides. You talked about an ecosystem of opportunity. We're making great strides. Since, David, we last spoke, certainly, we announced the world's largest floating offshore wind. ScotWind is the world's largest commercial round for floating offshore wind. Now, is Scottish Financial Services, they are at the table to ensure that the £25 billion of investment that's been promised, £1 billion for every gigawatt of energy generated, is it going to be Scotland's financial services is going to benefit from the financing of that, or is it going to be somebody else? So where there are significant economic opportunities, are they matched by the financing opportunities as well? So those would just be two very brief points, and I'll keep it brief because I definitely was the reason you overran on the timetable. So back to you, David.
It was well worth it. But no, I mean, I think that's there's a symbiosis here, isn't there? And there are other agents involved. I mean, I'd be interested, Kate, in terms of from a Scottish perspective. Or no, let me start with you, Mark. From a global perspective, I mean, do you think we're on a track, or do you, I mean, is this something that you feel optimistic that we're getting there? Or is this something where you think there's just too much blah, blah, blah in this and not enough real action?
I think we're on a track. I wouldn't take anything for granted. And I'd recognize absolutely, as everyone on this panel, part of the urgency is we left it very late. But we're on the track. One of the things that prevents this from being, to pick up on your question, blah, 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 is that at least with respect to addressing climate change, to getting to net zero, the advantage is these are hard numbers. You either have emissions or you don't. They're either going up, sideways, or down. They need to go down. We're setting up a system where all financial institutions are going to be reporting annually the emissions, not just of their operations, that's the easy bit, but the emissions of all their clients, all their investments, all their loans. And that will show the dynamics. So there's kind of nowhere to hide in this. Financial institutions, particularly Scottish financial institutions, are very good at managing numbers. It's one of the strengths. They know how to. People in Scotland know how to count. It's one of the strengths. And we will be counting emissions. Now, last point, and I'll finish on this, which is that what's critical, though, and this is the part of what we're building, is that the judgment about those pathways of emissions is it depends on the different sectors. If I'm going to go and lend to the steel sector, emissions are high in the steel sector, but it may be the right thing to do because they're investing in electric arc furnaces, or they're investing in renewable power that's coming into the steel sector to get those emissions down. And so it's putting money to work where the emissions are to get them down, because ultimately that's what we need to do.
Yeah, and it's tricky, isn't it? This needs to be something that I mean, you need to know these measures, but you need them in good faith, because I mean, in Scotland, for example, an oil industry that I guess has a limited life until we've got carbon capture and storage and so on, but you wouldn't want to close it today, so you have all that just transition stuff. A Kate, that needs to be managed, but with a clarity of where we need to get to by 2050, which is, as Mark says, needs to be measured and needs to be net zero.
Absolutely, and defining just transition, what is it we mean? It means not leaving communities behind. That's perhaps self-explanatory. It's about creating new work. But there's another side of this too, which is that in the pursuit of ethical financing, we're not at the same time removing communities or people's agency. And that for me is a particularly pressing issue in terms of our resources. I said in my opening comments that ultimately, if you break down the complexities of financing, it's about our money that's being invested for the greater good of our world. And that greater good starts with the communities on our doorsteps in every country around the world. And I guess in my first answer, I was saying we need to be clear with the public about what we're trying to do. And then secondly, we need to be clear what the parameters are. And that's why we talk a lot about collaborating with investors that share our values. You know, it's growth with a purpose, not growth at all costs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that feels right, doesn't it? I mean, it's, you know, 2/3 of household financial assets in the UK are pensions. Just crazy to be investing pensions for the short term, and they belong to millions upon millions of people. How does the finance industry represent that? Because politicians can set and have to set some important frameworks about reporting and, you know, internal combustion engines and all of those sorts of things. But in the end of the day, if the finance industry decides that it's going to work to rule rather than work to principle on this and not open up to those communities, that causes a problem. I don't know, Mark. I'd be interested in your experience in, you know, at the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. How do we get the finance system so that it's embracing these challenges? I mean, you've been terrific about, you know, talking about every decision you take has to take climate and I guess other things into account. But it's ever so difficult. It's ever so easy, isn't it, for the finance industry to decide, no, I'll just do it by the highest net present value, and that's the only calculation I think about.
Yeah, it's you look, there are certain things you can do to embed this into the processes of financial institutions. I'll give an example we haven't talked about, which is climate stress testing. And for those who don't follow it, what the regulator basically says to a bank, it could be the Royal Bank of Scotland, the question is, well, what if we succeed? What if we succeed in getting on the path to 1.5 degrees, and there's the right, you know, consumer decisions and government regulation and carbon prices? Where do you have losses and exposure? Which of your clients, your lenders, are ready, which aren't, and what does your balance sheet look like in that case? And that's a question that you know, Susan, former, you know, board member, and I think would say, well, I want to know the answer to that question. I want to know my senior management knows the answer to the question, has the ability to get that question. So that starts to drill into the management of the bank. Okay, I have to look at the world from that lens, at least one of the lenses. But it doesn't, to your question, David, necessarily mean that when the moment comes for the loan that they necessarily take that in. So you can lead the horse to water, the banking horse to water, if you will. But there has to be this broader sense of two things. One is that society, government regulation is going to get there in the end. So it may take a little longer, but eventually that carbon price, that regulation, that consumer behavior will come there. So I might as well be a bit ready for it. Or it requires the sort of core commitment to the underlying values, which is, you know, you can't legislate, you can't regulate. It has to be there, and it has to be consistent with where people are going. I think the critical point is that we're at a position coming out of Glasgow where we have a financial sector that's oriented to net zero. It's going to have the information and the tools, and you have this opportunity for this huge positive reinforcement from government policy, from consumer behavior, back through finance, who will then be looking for opportunities to get those emissions down. And that's the opportunity we need to seize.
Yeah. So we're trying to get this virtuous circle, and one that people buy into the creation of that virtuous circle. I mean, I am quite struck. We were looking through the members of the task force and how many of them are signed up to the GFANZ mark, and certainly all the big ones are. And since that's most of the Scottish finance industry, it feels like there is a real desire to do the right thing here. I don't know, Kate, if that's what you feel when you talk to the Scottish financial institutions.
I think that's a very fair characterization, David, that by and large, our establishment of the task force isn't just a political desire. It's actually a reflection of what industry are saying to us. And Omar said at the beginning that the task force will report to essentially the financial services board that we have in Scotland with representatives from across industry, because that's what they want. Now, our job, I think, is to facilitate that, make that as easy as possible, because the benefits are enormous. Just briefly touching on your last question about the challenges ahead. Net zero is easy to talk about. It's really difficult to deliver. Net zero by 2045, the monumental change that's required. And the financial industry, perhaps of all industries, is in a position to facilitate major change by moving money to sustainable investments. So they're at the table, they want to do it. It's now up to, I think, regulators and others and government to provide clear vision to help get there.
Yeah, and get some consensus about how we do this, and maybe that's doable in Scotland in a way that it's difficult to do in some enormous financial centre like London. I should say, I am struck by, my kids always tease me about how I always go on about everything being invented in Scotland, but actually the first savings bank was Scottish. The first actuarially sound pension fund was Scottish. The first investment trust was Scottish. Even the bloke who did the plan for the setting up of the Bank of England, he had a pretty murky past otherwise, but he was Scottish. And when you look at what's happening in ethical investment in Scotland, it's disproportionate to what is happening in the rest of the UK, and feels like there has to be something that we're able to build on there.